welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing war crimes in Syria, how to hold the Assad regime accountable, and comments made by U.S. Democratic presidential nominee Tulsi Gabbard that questioned if Assad has committed war crimes. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Ambassador Stephen Rapp, former U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues and Professor for Human Rights Issues at Georgetown University. Thank you so much, Ambassador Rapp, for joining us once again.
Glad to be back, Hayvi.
It's always a pleasure to have you.
Great, thank you.
I want to start by asking, about the evidence against the Assad regime. Now this topic has surfaced again, especially after the running for presidency. A Congresswoman, Tulsi Gabbard, said in a TV appearance that there are not enough evidence against Assad and his regime of committing mass atrocities, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Do you agree with this assessment?
I do not agree with that assessment. I prosecuted for the Rwanda genocide and for the mass atrocities in Sierra Leone, even convicted former President Charles Taylor of Liberia and sent him to prison for 50 years. And the evidence against Assad is much stronger than we had against Taylor, than my colleagues had against Milosevic and at the Yugoslavia Tribunal. As strong as the evidence at Nuremberg, to be frank, against the Nazis, in part because a lot of the crimes have been committed in government-run, security service-run institutions, which are directly under his control. Mm-hmm. And documents have been seized. Of course, at various times it was possible for people to work within Syria and get to security service offices, as those areas, say, fell to the Free Syrian Army. And tens of thousands, indeed, hundreds of thousands of pages of official stamped documents have come out, all of which represented the decision by the Assad regime and by him and by his National Security Bureau to suppress what was then a peaceful uprising of citizens in the street through mass arrests, disappearances, torture, and eventually murder. And of course, the Caesar photos that came to us at the end of 2013, pictures taken by a military photographer, a part of the police, military police within those institutions, which depict at least 6,700 individuals who were tortured to death with the very institutions in which they were tortured to death, carved on their bodies and included on a card. When you have that kind of crime within state institutions, the responsibility goes to the top under international law. Mm-hmm. To the top, to the president. Because if you can show he had effective control, and indeed with all of the orders and the structure and the way that system works, he had effective control. He certainly had knowledge of those events, and he failed to take any action to prevent or punish it. You don't even have to prove that he ordered it, but there's a lot of evidence that he did. So that's, as I've said, a slam dunk in terms of criminal prosecutions. Now, there are the other crimes, the use of poison gas, the attacks on civilians, and through barrel bombing, the incredible crimes committed against hospitals, doctors, ambulances, etc. Even in World War II, those norms were respected. And he hasn't. And clearly the knowledge of that going on and the failure to stop or prevent it or to control it in any way suggests that it's intentional, and that also leads directly up to him as the person from whom all orders come. So the case against him is actually much stronger than those that we've had elsewhere.
Well, it's massive when you say that, there's more evidence against the Assad regime than all of these other, talk about the Holocaust. And there's so many evidence of the Holocaust, yet now because we have technology that, and basically what happened, in Syria, this went on for so long, there is more evidence even than the Holocaust, which is unthinkable. And you have somebody like Tulsi Gabbard denying.
Yeah,
the fact that there are evidence, is that a lack of knowledge? Is that?
Well, it's willful blindness. If you're looking at it, it's somebody who's decided because they went to see this fellow and said positive things about him that they're going to act as if there's no evidence. But clearly it's there, and you only have to watch him being confronted with this evidence. When he was confronted with the Caesar photos, it was fake news. This is all propaganda against me and Syria. But then, of course, our own FBI has verified the validity of those photos, and they can say fake news, it's photoshopped, it's made up. No, you can deal with the metadata that could come with digital photographs and determine when they were taken and determine whether they're composites, because then the picture would have been taken at two different times and formed together into another image. So this has been confirmed. That the Germans, in fact, are analyzing every single photograph as part of their prosecutions, where they've now recently put out 3 arrest warrants against high-level officials.
I want to know more about this.
And then, of course, also engaged in arrest with the French of 3 individuals that were involved in the torture that are now in Europe and are now in jail. But they've relied on forensic analysis that's verified this material. And of course,
and the French as well. So now the Germans and the French have issued arrest warrants against members of the regime. And
actually made arrests, not of high-level individuals, but of lower-level individuals. But I mean, both of them, for instance, have an arrest warrant out against Jamil Hassan, who headed Air Force intelligence, ran a facility that we call Jawiya, that was near El Meza military hospital, where Caesar was taking the photographs. And hundreds of the photographs come from victims of that facility. And of course, we have people who survived that facility who recognize those victims. We recently here in Washington now have this survivor, Omar al-Shagri, who was in 215 and then in Sidnaya, and he was actually at one point assigned to put numbers on the bodies. And this was a time when the numbers on the bodies were then sent to the El Meza military hospital, and that's where Caesar took the photos. And he actually put the number on the body of his own cousin, and he recognizes that photo in his own handwriting.
He did that to his own cousin. So they had some prisoners doing the same, the number.
Like the Nazis, who would basically, force people who are going to die later to stay alive a few more days and engage in the really dirty work of execution and destruction of bodies. And he wrote those numbers and is prepared to testify to that effect, and is himself joined now as a petitioner in a case in Sweden. I'll be up there next week to talk to their prosecutors about how they're going to proceed.
So that's another case in Sweden.
Yes, another case where the victims have asked the prosecutor to proceed. They've done some lower level cases, frankly, most on the other side for abuses committed by armed groups, but they very much want to see a prosecution of the major crimes by the regime.
By the regime as well.
And they have a law that would permit that. So we're hoping to also have a warrant issued in Sweden.
Do countries like Germany, France, Sweden, and the United States, and you've been working on collecting the evidence on behalf of the United States, share these evidence with one another? And for example, the evidence I've seen in the Holocaust Museum, where they had the names of people written in blood on, things that I can't take off of my head, after seeing those terrifying, really saddening images. How can those countries, and do they, collaborate with one another to basically create this big body of evidence, a massive number of documents against the Assad regime?
These various units do meet together at least twice a year in The Hague. I was at their meeting in November. Most interestingly, the Germans and the French have now formed a joint investigative team, which is something permitted in Europe, most famously used for the plane crash of the MH17 that was shot down over Ukraine by a Russian missile. And there's a joint unit to do that. And this is the kind of way in which in America, when we have organized crime operating in different states, we have task forces that include the police and the FBI and the prosecutors in different jurisdictions. So it's really encouraging that there's that level of sharing. Beyond that, one of the organizations that I'm closely involved with, and in fact chair of their board of commissioners, is CIJA, the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. It has the 800,000 pages of documents at its headquarters in Europe. Last year received 79 requests from law enforcement in different countries on about 600 different individuals. So I'll be there at their headquarters next week, but you know, there's just a regular parade of law enforcement coming to their facilities where they've stored this material, as you would at a police facility, with chain of custody and with proper preservation and climate and other things, and then have teams of analysts that assist the international prosecutors. Beyond that, we now have this mechanism created by the UN General Assembly, the International Independent Mechanism for Syria, which is headquartered in Geneva, and it's now going to collect the information from CIJA and from Syrian civil society groups like the Syrian Network for Human Rights and the Syrian Archive, the video material, and verify it and vet it and make sure that it all is not fake news, isn't something that's not reliable, and work to share that with law enforcement. So there's a lot of efforts there to coordinate. In part needed because we don't have what we had, say, in Yugoslavia or Rwanda or Sierra Leone or with the Nazis, an international court to try these cases. Though there's some prospect now, as I'm sure you know, because of this, of these petitions that have been filed regarding Jordan and Syria.
So in a new development, 28 Syrian refugees in Jordan filed a complaint to Lahai, the ICC, about war crimes also committed by the Assad regime against them. Do you think this is going to be a case that will be accepted, or would it move forward by the ICC?
Well, this is a very creative filing, and I should say there are actually two groups of Jordanian-based refugees that have joined in this, and two different groups of attorneys that are proceeding, and I'm closely associated with one of those groups. And it's based upon a decision, more or less an advisory opinion, entered by a chamber of the International Criminal Court last year in regard to the crimes against the Rohingya, who we know, Muslim group that was against which horrible crimes have been committed, according to international reports, in Myanmar, or Burma, as some people call it, that forced them over the course of just a month or so, for about 700,000 of them to escape or really be forced into, for their own safety, the next door country, Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a party to the ICC. Burma or Myanmar is not. Of course, Syria is not a party to the ICC, but Jordan is. And so with that, with the court saying, well, the crime of forced deportation of the Rohingya from Myanmar into Bangladesh was really a crime which touched two states. And forced deportation isn't a crime until they cross a border. And once they hit that border, that's a key element of the crime, and that part of the crime is committed in Bangladesh. So it's sort of like shooting somebody over a border. Either country can prosecute. And in the case of a country that's in the ICC, that case can go to the International Criminal Court. Well, the same analysis is being used by these 28 and by this other group to see if the ICC would take a case on Syria. Understand it would deal really exclusively with the crimes probably in the south, a lot of them relatively early in the conflict, where up to 1 million people were basically forced into Jordan for their own safety. And this filing is made with the Office of the Prosecutor in The Hague. Victims don't have the ability to actually start a case, but the prosecutor will evaluate it, and if she finds that that these are crimes within the jurisdiction of the court, that they're similar to what happened with the Rohingya, she could open a preliminary examination, begin to gather evidence, and if she came to the conclusion that there was a strong case and nothing else was being done, and that she could ask the judges to open a formal investigation. Now, understand the crimes wouldn't be for torture or murder or rape, etc., but they would all be part of the case. It would be the crime of forced deportation, but all of the crimes of force and violence, all of that evidence that caused people to leave, the bombing of the neighborhoods. I mean, if you think of what happened in Daraa with the torture of the children, etc., the fact
Rape,
that every people were having
whatever's
their children
happening.
and family members picked up and disappeared, that created sort of conditions under which they could not safely live in those communities in the South, and then essentially the only way they could live with safety was to be in was essentially to be in Jordan. In effect, that was pushing them into Jordan.
Yes.
You know, it's an interesting case. It's a way in which the ICC can become involved. We'll see if it happens, but it's a new.
When will it depend on?
It'll take a time. It's the kind of thing that could take. I mean, the prosecutor got a determination on the Rohingya in September, and she hasn't yet proceeded to seek a formal investigation. She's still.
So they said yes on the Rohingya case.
They said that the law was there that she could use.
Okay.
Now she would have to show that there were facts and evidence that was out there that could prove a violation of that law. So that's the next step. I anticipate that will occur in the case of
Syria.
Burma. In the case of Burma.
Syria.
But you know, in Syria, we'll see, but that's further away. I mean, you know, this opens up a lot of potential other situations, and it has implications for the court, and the court will have some difficulty investigating these things because they may not have the cooperation of Jordan even in this case, you know, et cetera. So who knows how it's all going to.
So there is that factor where you say that there's this country, and in the Bangladesh case, they wanted to cooperate,
they've made submissions. Bangladesh has supported. They haven't made their submissions public, but they've supported justice for the Rohingya in this case. And I would suspect in the end of the day, Jordan would, but obviously Jordan has been profoundly affected by the refugee situations and is obviously at the moment pressing to try to get peace in Syria, and
but that would
what
scare
exactly
them.
its position will be, I don't know. But obviously, Jordan has certainly been profoundly impacted by doing the right thing and taking 1 million refugees into the country.
When we talk about the German case, when they're now asking Lebanon formally to give them Jamil Hassan, did any similar situation happen in previous tribunals where someone like Jamil Hassan was actually extradited to a foreign court?
Now, we've had the most famous situation 20 years ago with the former dictator of Chile, Augusto Pinochet, who was sought in Spain for the crimes that he committed in Chile. And under universal jurisdiction, and there were also some of the survivors of those crimes living in Spain that had pursued that case. And he went to London, friend of Margaret Thatcher at the time, I guess, to receive medical care in the same way that Jamil Hassan has gone to Beirut for medical care. And lo and behold, he was arrested. And the matter was kicked around in the courts, and eventually the courts in the UK determined that he could be sent to Spain to stand trial. Now, in the end, the Home Secretary decided to send him back to Chile on the grounds that he was suffering from ill health, and extradition is discretionary in this situation between these countries. So that's what happened. Of course, when he got back to Chile, then they actually began a prosecution against him. He died while under court investigation. So you do have that kind of precedent that's occurred with these third country courts. Now, this is not the same as the international courts. I was at the Rwanda Tribunal, and after they won the genocide but actually lost the war, the leaders of what was then the government and the military of Rwanda escaped in all sorts of different directions, and the rich ones got pretty far away, and we ended up arresting them in like 29 different countries.
Wow.
29 different countries arrested them and handed them over to the court and brought them to East Africa, where they were prosecuted at this UN tribunal. So the international courts have had a real precedent of being able to reach out and get these people arrested. It's more rare when you have a third country where the crimes didn't happen, getting the perpetrator from from another third country sent to them. But the Pinochet case stands as a precedent. I hope that Lebanon will honor the extradition request. However, Lebanon and its political process with Hezbollah and the government, and Hezbollah supporting Assad, and the
Seems
way in
pretty
which it hasn't
difficult.
cooperated in terms of making the arrests of the people accused in the Hariri assassination. Their political system there so much depends upon this kind of everybody all inside, and everything has to be agreed by everybody. Under those circumstances, it'll probably be hard for Lebanon to extradite, but I wish they would, and the U.S. government has in fact supported the extradition and called for Lebanon to do it, which is extraordinary because in the past the U.S. hasn't been real forward-leaning on these third country cases, but in the case of Syria, that's been, in a way, almost the only game in town. And so we really need that. And there's no question that Germany and France have the right to proceed with these cases. I mean, look at Germany with 800,000 Syrian refugees. They've been profoundly affected by this case. And the reason those refugees are there, not just because there's a war in Syria, but because of the horrible atrocities that have made life impossible for people to survive in Syria.
Exactly. I want to talk about the Marie Colvin case because that was also unprecedented case win against the Assad regime on behalf of Marie Colvin's family. How much could this help in other similar cases of American either detainees that we don't know about, like Austin Tice, the American journalist who is still missing in Syria, and then obviously other victims who were tortured and killed by the Assad regime?
Well, these kind of cases do open the possibility of prosecutions in the United States. U.S. law is not as wide open as, for instance, German law. We don't have universal jurisdiction. We can only prosecute if the individual that we're seeking to prosecute is present in American soil. That's unlikely to happen with the Jamil Hassans and the Syrian torturers. I don't think they're going to come this way. Or if one of our own citizens has been victimized. And so the citizenship, and there are certainly cases, think about Benghazi. Eventually the U.S. Was able to obtain the arrest in Libya of one of the guys involved in the killings in Benghazi and try that person in the United States. So we do reach out when our own citizens are harmed in other countries and prosecute them in the United States if there's no possibility of a fair trial elsewhere. So there's precedent for that, and the Marie Colvin case is a classic example. I mean, obviously an American citizen, cold-blooded murder in her case. Now, of course, her case is in many ways a harder case than the torture cases because a journalist that goes into a war zone, quite often journalists are injured or killed unintentionally in the crossfire. But it wasn't crossfire in her case. It was they wanted to kill her because of her reporting on what was happening. And in fact, according to the evidence, the person who killed her, who got the shot that killed her and her French photographer Remy Ochlik, was rewarded with a car by President Assad's brother, Maher el-Assad, the head of the 4th Division, and so general of the 4th Division. And so, they were.
He was rewarded. I didn't even hear that part.
Yeah,
even when I
indeed.
interviewed the family's lawyer.
It was such a great thing that they killed this reporter, et cetera. And if you look at all the orders that we had at CIJA, we must stop these journalists who are reporting on stories that harm the image of Syria.
Exactly, harming the image of Syria was the excuse.
Right, et cetera, by telling the truth, And so and the truth in Homs and Bab al-Amr was that they were attacking civilian neighborhoods where there was no rebellion at all.
Yes.
And killing them and destroying, doing that to suppress the fire of the public protests. Yes. So that's a murder case. Now, in America, it was possible to file a lawsuit against Syria. We have a law that allows us to sue a foreign state if that state is a state sponsor of terrorism. There are 4 countries that are on that list. Syria is one of them.
Yes.
And so that permitted that case to go forward against the Syrian state and eventually to sue to provide the papers to the Czech embassy, which represents the Syrian state in Washington, and to get jurisdiction and to eventually get to this famous judge, Amy Berman Jackson, that entered the judgment for $302 million in favor of the survivors of Marie Colvin. But that also could be a criminal prosecution in the United States. The U.S. FBI can build a case and prosecute Maher Assad in the United States, put out a warrant for his arrest. Now, will he be arrested in Damascus and sent? Probably not, but there's always the possibilities
of him leaving,
or going elsewhere and us getting cooperation. I mean, we've had that with like the Russian arms dealer Victor Bout, who we got in Bangkok and eventually got Thailand to extradite. So there can be all sorts of possibilities there. And the French, by the way, is, to my knowledge, pursuing the case on the same basis, potential
against
criminal against
Maher
Assad and others involved in it based upon the killing of the photographer, who's a French citizen.
Yes.
So that's a possibility, and we certainly don't want Austin Tice to die, or Dr. Maj Kamalmas to be killed. We want them to be released, but if they were killed. And Leila Shukani, an American,
she
was killed, yes, in December of 2016.
That could be another case.
That could be another case. And
so what is the prospect for that?
Well, the prospects are, right now there's an FBI unit that investigates these things. There's a proposal actually to disband that unit and to move it into another place. And that's something that a number of us are working hard on because they've done some great cases in the past. They prosecuted Charles Taylor Jr., the son of the president of Liberia, because he was involved in torture in Liberia. And we prosecuted Miami, got a 97-year sentence. I mean, they've done some cases like this in the past, and I think it's important that they continue to do them. It is more difficult to deal with a case where the perpetrators aren't easily within the reach of the court, because you make an arrest, you put a case together, and then you never get to go to court.
Yes.
So it takes a kind of a high-level decision that you're going to prioritize that kind of thing,
in Leila
as
Sheikhani's
opposed
case,
to the bird in the hand kind of case.
Yes. In Leila Sheikhani's case, who would you be going after?
Well,
how high can you go?
You would have to, and American law doesn't have command responsibility, so you would have to deal with individuals in Sednaya, and in the process that caused her execution, etc. Now, you can find there's evidence from Sednaya that she was previously in another facility and what happened there, and there's people that saw her. People that, there's information from CIJA, et cetera, about who's in the structure of those organizations. But the U.S. would as a general rule, when you pursue a case in court in the U.S., they want very solid evidence of the perpetration of the specific individual. In a way, obviously, the Marie Colvin case, even though it's this difficult case of bombardment when bombs are going off all the time in Bab al-Amr, is a case that's been more solidly investigated. Of course, it also relies on some informants that inform us on the question of giving the car, et cetera. And so are those reliable? Would they testify? These are things that have to be weighed up, because prosecutors generally only pursue cases when there's lots of evidence and there's not the risk of going through a whole trial and having it fail.
There's now a new case that might be linking Assad and his regime to ISIS and basically providing support to ISIS, not only through buying oil, but also supplying ISIS with materials that could be used in war. And that could mean, a game-changing situation.
Well, and that's extremely
Assad.
important.
Can you tell me about this more?
Keep in mind, we've had certainly when we talk to people like Mazen Hamada, who was in Jawiya, describing how periodically the jihadis would be let out, whereas people like him, who was an oil engineer, who'd been a demonstrator, he was kept in, et cetera. So there's always, and there certainly was evidence during the Iraq period that Assad was using terrorists to attack the United States and Iraq, et cetera. And so, and there's been a lot of this other information about the connection, and clearly it's been to his advantage to present this as I'm fighting terrorism and there's nobody in between. It's me or them, and you've got to go with me, et cetera. So it's to his advantage to build them up and tear down everybody else. But proving that connection has been difficult, but it's important to do it. And it's important to do it for political reasons, because there still is this popular perception that this regime is effective against terrorism. In fact, it's both for the reasons of this backdoor aid, but also because they create recruits. I mean, when people see their own villages destroyed and their children arrested and tortured to death and chemical weapons poured down on top of them, they say, who's going to protect us?
Yes.
And if, you know, they end up as a default joining the jihadis because
Yes.
they're fighting, et cetera. And so he creates more jihadis. He
Yes.
creates ISIS.
So that could be also used.
And so but that's all. But these are political arguments. These are
Yes.
reasons why there shouldn't be essentially a normalization, which some are pushing for, saying, "Well, Assad won the war. Let's bring him back in.
Yes.
You know, let's reseat him in the Arab League. Let's turn the page, et cetera." That kind of thing. And you've seen Bashir of Sudan and come there. You've seen UAE open diplomatic relations, et cetera. But that seems to be stopped at this point because of the large perception, which is quite accurate, that he's been the catspaw of Iran. And as American own intelligence has said, about 80% of these units that have been fighting this war most recently are Iranians or Iranian-backed militias, et cetera.
Yeah.
So those are the people he relies on, and so
this ISIS
they're
case
even stronger in his support than the Russians. So it's I think we're there's the politics of it at the moment are stopping that normalization, but it's not done yet because clearly there's a lot of interest in Syria rebuilding. One can understand the need to rebuild a country that's had this horrible destruction, but if rebuilding means essentially stealing the property of people who were tortured to death and building something on them on which this regime or the Iranians or Russians can profit, then anyone that does that rebuilding is in fact complicit in the crime.
Yes.
And that's part of the message that I think continues to be, that I send from a legal standpoint. And now, as you probably heard yesterday, legislation was proposed in Congress, sponsored by the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Engel from Democrat of New York, and Congressman Kinzinger from Republican of Illinois, that essentially said, no aid, no reconstruction for Syria in the absence of a political transition.
I mean, this conversation can go on for a long time, but this is our time for today. Thank you so much, Ambassador Rapp, for joining us. Love to have you.
Glad to be with you always, Hayvi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
To continue talking about this, we are now joined by David Crane, founding Chief Prosecutor for the Special Court for Sierra Leone and Director for the Syrian Accountability Project. Thank you so much, Professor David Crane, for joining us once again from North Carolina.
It's my pleasure to be here.
I want to start by talking, about the new case of Syrian refugees in Jordan filing a complaint to the ICC about war crimes and crimes against humanity committed against them by the Assad regime. And now we know that there's a team of British lawyers led by Rodney Dixon who said that this is a very positive development for Syrian victims. What are your expectations on this specific complaint against the Assad regime?
This is a very exciting and new development in what I call the third wave of modern international criminal law. The first wave being where we started out at Nuremberg at the International Military Tribunal. The second wave is a wave that I helped start, the modern international criminal law system. But now in the past 2 years, we've seen the world step away from the international approach to justice and have turned to more domestic orientations to seek justice for victims of atrocity. And what we see here is just that. We see victims, we see lawyers, we see other individuals involved in this area. Since the international community is not going to do anything about what's been happening in Syria, they're taking their own initiatives. So we do see victims suing. We do see a very interesting initiative by my good friend Rodney Dixon in Britain, again, seeking lawsuits that bring individuals before a court for a fair and open trial for what they've done to the people of Syria.
So Rodney Dixon is your friend. What does it mean when he is taking on this case? And when you're talking about domesticating these different lawsuits and complaints against the Assad regime, could that be helpful in the long term or the medium term on rallying these different evidence, cases, and basically trying to go to the ICC or having a more of an international coalition to, basically accountability in Syria?
Well, the bright red thread of all of this is politics, and there's just no political will at this point internationally to do something about the tragedy that is Syria. And so we're seeing states like Germany and in Sweden and Norway and Denmark and other nations seeking their own paths for justice individually for victims of the atrocity. In my mind, we're not going to see any kind of major international effort, and maybe even not even a regional effort, to do anything about the tragedy that was Syria. However, it's important for your listeners to understand that there is no statute of limitations on these types of crimes, international crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity. So just because there are some individualized domestic efforts to seek justice, over time, there may be a moment where we could actually seek justice at the international level for the victims of this tragedy.
When you talk about over time, and I've heard that before from others, what are we talking about? Like, how many years does it usually take to get a regime and basically the heads of that specific regime to be held accountable?
Well, sometimes it may take decades. We're still prosecuting camp guards for the Nazi concentration camps. So it could take a long time, but it's important that the justice that we seek eventually will happen. Someday Assad will have a knock at the door, and there'll be somebody, an international prosecutor like I was, saying, come with me. So Assad is not out of the woods as far as his criminal liability at the international level, and he knows it.
Yes.
But at this point in time, there's just no political will to do anything in the short term or medium term. So it could take 10, 15 years before something happens, but there may be a political moment where the international community decides to do something about the Assad regime. And all the players, it's important to understand, all the players within this Syrian tragedy on both sides have been committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so as head of the Syrian Accountability Project, we're developing cases against all of these individuals, not just the Assad regime.
We saw right now also that there is Jamil Hassan held in Lebanon, and he's been asked for by Germany because of also him being implicated in crimes against humanity there. Do you think that this is something that Lebanon, knowing the situation, the political situation inside of Lebanon, would be willing to, basically extradite Jamil Hassan?
That remains to be seen. I'm a little skeptical. Lebanon is in the middle of quite a mess on all sides, and they may make a political calculation that it is not worth the many political challenges if they turn this general over, even though I would ask that they would turn him over, and I applaud Germany for making the effort to do so. But I just don't think Germany has the political clout to force any kind of movement and having this individual handed over. I hope he does. I hope they do. But I wouldn't be surprised if Lebanon declines the request.
Now also there's another general from the Assad regime who ran away to Europe and was captured. His name is Anwar Ruslan. And he's been also implicated himself of committing torture and human rights violations. In your opinion, when you have these personnel being captured now in Europe, how much could that help in this ongoing case building, evidence gathering situation that could, when it gets higher, how high could it get in terms of, implicating Assad himself?
Well, again, I applaud all efforts to seek justice for victims, and if it's one individual at a time, then so be it, until we have the political will internationally to have an international tribunal or some type of special court. Again, countries of Europe in this, quote, third wave of accountability are taking matters in their own hands, since there is no political will internationally to do anything about it, and going after these individuals. So I think it sets a good precedent. It lets the people of Syria know that people are doing something to seek justice for them, but it also sends an important signal to those who are in charge on all sides of this tragedy that there is an accountability coming, and they need to be concerned about that. So again, I think it's important that we're doing something. If we do nothing, then we're moving down a very dark slope.
Right now, we've heard basically a candidate running to be nominated by the Democratic Party for a presidency, Tulsi Gabbard. She's a congresswoman on behalf of Hawaii. She basically said recently in an interview that she does not know of enough evidence against Assad and his regime implicating them in any war crimes and crimes against humanity. Do you agree with her assessment?
I think it's very misinformed and unfortunate, particularly individuals who are seeking the presidency of this country who are already suffering under an individual who has no understanding about accountability related to atrocity. And for someone running for president to say that she doesn't think that there is accountability in Syria is really, truly misinformed. And I was quite shocked. And really, it develops a political problem for her that isn't necessary. She might have individual thoughts about this. Publicly go after this individual, to say these things is really quite unfortunate.
So in your opinion, there are enough evidence against Assad and his regime implicating them in war crimes and crimes against humanity?
Oh, certainly. There is a great deal of evidence. I have been working on this tragedy since March of 2011. And we've been creating a crime-based matrix. We've been creating a conflict map and drafting various indictments against individuals who have done such terrible things to the country and to the region. So, yes, he is clearly culpable. I was the co-author of the famous Caesar report, which first time brought direct, specific evidence of industrialized killing going on in Syria, led by President Assad and his henchmen. That alone would get him convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for the destruction of over 11,000 Syrians in their detention camps. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens of these detention camps and untold thousands of individuals who were tortured and destroyed horribly in these places. So yes, there's a very strong case being developed by the independent mechanism as well, an idea that I fostered back 2 years ago, and now it's working very well to develop a strong legal case against all parties within the Syrian tragedy.
I mean, as somebody who's been working on this, and I've had you on 6 years ago, I believe the first time, but you've been working on gathering these evidence against whoever the perpetrators are in the war in Syria. How did you feel after the Marie Colvin case and her family winning $302 million against the Assad regime? And not about the money, but in terms of the American judicial system finally having a verdict against the Assad regime for what they've been doing.
We get our victories where we can, and it's a very, very important development civilly against individuals that commit these atrocities around the world. It sets a good legal precedent so that not only can we go after dictators and thugs criminally and hold them accountable, but they also can be held civilly liable potentially in the U.S. courts and perhaps in other domestic courts for what they've done. And trust me, having gone after dictators myself and indicted them, that really hurts. They enjoy their money, and if you go after them and go after their pocketbook, it really gets their attention.
It gets the attention. Right now also, I mean, after this case, we know of other Americans who are either missing in Syria, like journalist Austin Tice, there's the Dr. Kamal Maz, who are still missing, and then there's the Sheikhani, I think her last name is the girl who was killed by the Assad regime in the detention center inside of Syria. What would that mean for these two types of cases of American citizens being the victims?
Well, again, if we have federal courts that are interested in getting through the jurisdictional challenges, but actually listening and allowing these cases to be tried, it really sets up an important precedent. What happens then is if we have a judgment against one of these individuals who have committed these atrocities, any assets that they have within the United States that the federal courts and the Department of Justice can seize, those assets can be seized in order to satisfy the judgment. So real estate, bank accounts, other property, personal and real property, can be seized to satisfy the judgment. So, and these judgments don't go away, and so they can be filed against these individuals from now on. So again, this is a very positive sign, and I was very, very pleased have the Coben family to actually have that happen. But also, again, it's just another way by which we can face down these dictators who feed around the edges of civilization, committing atrocities against their own citizens.
What about those other American individuals? What would be the prospect of us actually having other lawsuits filed in the United States to help out the families of these other individuals and bring the perpetrators of whatever happened to them to justice?
Well, again, it opens up the possibility. We have a case of first impression, and other federal courts will follow suit. So again, there are some challenges relating to jurisdiction and meeting the particular aspects of the statutes that are in question here. But at the end of the day, this is the beginning, I think, of a positive beginning. But it's just the beginning, and I think this will play out over time.
I want to ask you lastly about a new case that has been filed also against the Assad regime on the basis of connection and working with ISIS, which could mean something much bigger for the United States since, these terrorist groups are actually waging a war against the United States, such as ISIS. This new lawsuit is not only going to be talking about the Assad regime buying oil from ISIS, but also selling and providing materials to ISIS, including some materials that helped ISIS in its fight, its war against the United States and its allies and the civilians in these areas. What would that mean if this case goes on and we're seeing more evidence of this particular question here about Assad assisting ISIS in its war? What would that mean for Assad and the United States, basically, in how it views the Assad regime?
Well, the United States has a very dim view of the Assad regime, and so this isn't going to certainly help any kind of potential relationships. But I'm not surprised. In the 21st century, conflict has devolved into these what I call dirty little wars. And Syria is one of the first, what I call the kaleidoscopic concept of these dirty little wars. People are working together to defeat a common enemy, yet they're helping the common enemy. At one point in time, the United States was seeking to overthrow the Assad regime. At the same time, it was working with the Assad regime to fight ISIS and others. And so we're almost seeing a situation where everybody's your enemy, everybody's your friend. And it's quite kaleidoscopic. One thing changes, everything changes. So I'm not surprised that Assad and the family, it's very important to understand, this is a family-oriented business of running and destroying Syria. And so the entire Assad family is in this to make money on the backs of the Syrian people. And the fact that they are, in fact, buying and selling and brokering oil with ISIS doesn't surprise me at all.
I mean, I think this conversation must continue because new things are happening every day. We're hearing new lawsuits, new cases, new evidence against the Assad regime. But I think that's where we're going to be ending today. Thank you so much, David Crane, for joining us. I'd always love to have you and talk about this more in the future.
My pleasure. Let's continue our conversation.
Thank you. That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching us. Good night.